Welcome back to our reading of Max and the Millions. I hope you're enjoying it so far. Today we're going to read Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. Chapter 5. Max's footsteps faded down the corridor. The bedroom fell into silence once more. The light stayed on. It filled the empty room, casting shadows on the models, their glass eyes sparkling. Of course, the room wasn't really empty. There's no such thing as an empty room. There's life everywhere you go. Mice under the floorboards, moths in the curtains, dust mites in the air. There's a whole universe living alongside us and we barely even notice it. Take the handful of sand on the floor. If Max had studied it for a little longer, he might have seen that it was covered in more than just tiny palm trees. He might have seen that its surface was also flecked with spots of red, green, and blue. He might have seen that the spots were moving. But Max didn't see the spots tremble and then disappear. He didn't see the sand grow and spread across the floor all by itself. No one did. The world is filled with millions of miracles that no one sees. No one saw what emerged from the sand either. It was almost too small to make out. And even if someone had seen it, they probably wouldn't have believed their eyes. It was a tiny wooden hut. 8 weeks later. Chapter 6. The summer holidays were almost over. Mr. Pitt stood at the school gates practising his speech. "Delighted to welcome you all back to St. Goliath's. As you can see, the Pitt building is finally complete." Not true. The builders had tried to explain to Mr. Pitt that 8 weeks was not enough time to build everything he'd asked for, but Mr. Pitt was insistent. The school governors were going to arrive at the end of the day, and if they didn't like what they saw, then Mr. Pitt was as good as sacked. He told the builders that if the work wasn't finished on time, they'd be facing a lawsuit. So big, it made their eyes water. Mr. Pitt wasn't worried. He always got what he wanted. Besides, he had a triumphant speech to prepare. "As headmaster, I pride myself on placing students first. Care and concern for each one of you. Blah, blah, blah." He stopped. A boy with a suitcase was walking through the school gates ahead of him. "Oi, you!" yelled Mr. Pitt. "What are you doing? This is private property." The boy stopped in his tracks. I'm Max, sir. I go to school here." "Never heard of you," Mr. Pitt barked. "Now get lost before I shove that suitcase." The headmaster saw Max's hearing aids and finally remembered who he was. He switched from anger to friendliness, like someone changing channels on the TV. "Ah, Max, how wonderful to—" "I said, how wonderful to see you." The shout made Max's hearing aids give a whistle of feedback, and he winced. "You don't need to shout, sir. It actually makes it harder for me to—" "Why are you here, Max? Term doesn't start until Monday." Max sighed and took a step back so Mr. Pitt couldn't spit on him quite as much. "My great-aunt Meredith booked my ticket back for today, sir," he explained. "I tried to tell her it was too early, but she just fell asleep. Can I stay in the boarding house until term starts?" Mr. Pitt grimaced. "Is there nowhere else you can go?" Max looked around. I guess I could sleep out here under my suitcase." Mr. Pitt thought about it. "That's a kind offer, Max, but somebody might see you." He sighed. "I suppose you'll have to stay in the boarding house." "Thank you, sir." "We'll bill your aunt for the extra days. This way, please." Mr. Pitt grabbed Max's arm and marched him past the building site, trying to block his view. "Now, Max, as you can see, the school is making some final tweaks and adjustments. Nothing to worry about, of course, but I must insist you stay inside the boarding house at all times." Max grinned. "That's fine by me, sir." A weekend in the boarding house was exactly what Max wanted. He'd spent the holidays itching to get back to St. Goliath's to see if Mr. Darrow had returned. The caretaker would have found Max's castle by now and left him another message. Once Mr. Pitt was gone, Max could sneak up to the staff bedrooms and, "Don't worry, you'll have plenty to do," said Mr. Pitt. "I'm going to put you to work with the Summer Club." Max's face fell. The Summer Club? They came to the boarding house and Max's heart sank. The front doors were covered in streamers and stickers of cartoon unicorns wearing fabulous outfits. "Sparkle Pony Summer Club." Max gulped. "Sir, isn't that for 5-year-old girls?" "Yes, Max, 50 of them, and they need plenty of looking after. Unfortunately, our regular staff were all hospitalised this morning when one of them touched a light switch." Max and Mr. Pitt stepped inside the boarding house. Every available surface was coated in glitter glue and sequins. There were 3 stereos playing 3 different songs at full volume, and 50 girls in fairy wings screaming their heads off. This was Max's worst nightmare. He could lip-read a conversation with one person if they were facing him and speaking clearly, but adding another person made it twice as hard. It meant Max had to spend the whole time looking back and forth to work out who was talking. Looking after these girls would be like playing 50 games of chess blindfolded while someone threw tennis balls at him. "Sir, should I really be in charge of all these girls by myself?" Mr. Pitt looked horrified. "What, one 10-year-old boy in charge of 50 young girls? Of course not! There'll be 2 of you. Ah, there he is now." Mr. Pitt pointed to a boy covered from head to toe in screaming girls. It took Max a moment to recognise him. Sasha? Sasha saw Max and turned ghost white. He looked, well, different. He wasn't wearing expensive clothes. In fact, he was wearing a bright purple unicorn onesie and had a butterfly drawn on his face. He shook off the girls like a dog drying himself. Max, what are you doing here?" Mr. Pitt clapped Sasha on the back, clearly having forgotten the 2 boys were roommates. "Max, this is Sasha. He's been here all summer, helping us run the club. Thankfully, he wasn't electrocuted with the other 12 volunteers this morning. Isn't that right, Sasha?" Sasha didn't answer. He was staring at Max like he was going to be sick. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to find him still at school, let alone dressed as a purple unicorn. Mr. Pitt strode towards the door. "I'll leave you boys to it. If you need me, I'll be upstairs. I'm going to check Mr. Darrow's room and make sure no one's broken in." Max's heart clenched. "But broken in?" "Oh, yes," said Mr. Pitt. "This morning one of the builders noticed the bedroom light had been left on all holiday. A child must have snuck in on the last day of term. If I find out who set foot in that corridor, I'll expel him so fast it'll make his head spin." Max's head was spinning already. There could be a message waiting for him in Mr. Darrow's bedroom. And even if there wasn't, Max's model castle was still on the bedroom floor with his name carved into the base. Several images quickly passed through Max's mind. Mr. Pitt finding the castle, Mr. Pitt expelling Max in front of the whole school, Max spending the rest of his life scraping Great Aunt Meredith's tongue clean after every meal. Mr. Pitt stopped at the door and pulled out his phone, which had started to ring. Max leapt at the chance. Just going to put my suitcase away, sir." Max flew out of the door. Mr. Pitt barely noticed him leave, and Sasha was busy trying to scrub the butterfly from his face. Max knew he might have only a few seconds. Run into Mr. Darrow's room, grab the castle, run out. That was the plan. If Mr. Pitt caught him before he got back downstairs, it didn't even bear thinking about. Max threw his suitcase into a cupboard and sprinted up the stairs to the staff corridor. Sure enough, he could see the light peeking from under Mr. Darrow's bedroom door. He grabbed the key from behind the painting, unlocked the door and threw it open. He stepped inside the room. Max was struck by a thought. What if Mr. Darrow hadn't come back? Would it mean that no one else had been in the room all summer? It would mean that everything would be exactly as Max had left it. It would mean that behind the door, time would have stood still for 8 whole weeks. After all, thought Max, what can happen in an empty room? X111 or 8. But the wise man said, "Do not fear, the Great One will keep us safe, and one day he will return through the bedroom door and take us all away to paradise." X1V or 9. Oh, sorry, 13, 14. At this, the people of the floor were greatly excited. They all cried, "Long live the Great One!" 15. And someone said, "Wait, sorry, who is this Great One exactly?" 16. And the people replied, "Are you serious, Terry? He's the one who created us, tried to keep up." 17. Then someone asked the wise man, "What shall we do with ourselves until the Great One comes back?" 18. The wise man gazed upon the floor, was silent for some time. He looked at the vast world before him, at the bulb and the bin and the bed, and the desert sands that stretched from wall to wall. 19. Then he turned to the people, the reds and the greens and blues. This is what he said. 20. We shall build. Ooh, so what do we think that means? We'll come back to read chapter 7 in our next video.